Well, we've gone through and we've created our vCenter appliance, and we've added our inventory, we've created some folders, we've established some permissions, we've done a lot of stuff at this point. And if I were to lose my vCenter server, right, complete catastrophic failure, the last thing I would want to do is have to redo all of that. Now, I know we have the ability to back up our virtual machines, and we'll talk about backing up virtual machines a little bit later on and how we do that. But I want to be able to back up the configuration of vCenter completely separately from that, so that if I had to do a restore through that vCenter installer, that I would have the ability to do that. So here in lesson 6, we're going to have a look at backing up and restoring the vCenter appliance. Okay, so we'll create a backup schedule, and we'll actually be able to do a restore from one of those backups that we create. This is our job, right, as vCenter administrators, as vSphere administrators, to ensure the continuity of business in this environment. And certainly a backup and restore mechanism is an important feature of this. Okay, we want to, in our virtual beans example use case, we want to make sure that we back up vCenter server data itself. Things like the logs, performance data, and that kind of stuff. As changes occur, we want to do this at the very least at a monthly basis. We want vCenter itself to be highly available. We are establish an SLA, in our case, 4.9's availability. 4.9's availability only gives us 52.56 minutes of unplanned downtime a year. That's actually not very much at all, okay? Then we'll have a look at vCenter performance to make sure that we avoid problems in the infrastructure. So let's look at how we actually do this. So you'll notice here that we're not working with the vSphere client itself. We're working with the VAMI interface, the vSphere Appliance Management Interface, that we can see here operates on port 5480. See if we can get that in there, right? So point to your vCenter server itself, and then head over to port 5480 and log in with a username and password that is local to that vCenter server itself. In many cases, that username will be root, okay? So this allows us to manage the vCenter appliance, okay? And allows us within this to create a backup bundle, a zip file, if you will, that we can ship off somewhere else, okay? This allows us to do backups out of band of our normal backup systems. And as a vSphere administrator, anytime I want to make changes or anything like that, performing a backup is a pretty good thing to do, okay? Now, as we are moving the backup out of vCenter, we support FTP, HTTP, HTTPS, NFS, and SMB or CIFS shares as protocols and their secure equivalents to store this backup data, these zip files. Everything is done in terms of a restore from that vCenter appliance installer that we saw before. If you remember, there were those 4 boxes that said install, upgrade, migrate, or restore. You'll hit that restore button, okay? When you restore, it builds a brand new appliance and then asks you for your zip file for which it can then import the data into that brand new appliance. So yeah, there are different ways of backing up this appliance. You can use this file-based backup and restore through the appliance management interface, do the restore from the GUI installer, okay? We can schedule these backups and the like, okay? You can also do image-based backup and restore. And what this does is has a separate backup system point to vCenter, get a list of the VMs among which vCenter is one, right? Get a list of the VMs and then back up their virtual machine files, including all of the VMDKs and the VMX files and those other files that we've talked about before. When it comes to the first part of this, which is the backup, once again, this is either done immediately or scheduled through the appliance management interface. You'll notice down here that there's a backup link where we can configure the backup and hit the backup now button. When we hit the backup now button, it asks us for a location and will, as a part of the location, will list the protocol. In this case, we're going to do an FTP backup to an FTP server and then the location, the folder in that location. We need credentials to back up the server, so we'll type in our root credentials here. We will optionally encrypt the backup, and so we'll give a password that'll be where we'll encrypt it. We will decide whether or not as a part of the backup to do a database health check, okay? And we'll choose what data to back up. Now the inventory and the configuration of vCenter is automatically done, but you can also choose whether or not to add statistics, events, and tasks as a part of that backup. Now, the larger your vCenter, the more active it is, the longer it's been running, the more inventory you've got, right? The larger the stats, events, and tasks will be. So keep in mind the total size when you're done to make sure that your FTP server or CIF server or NFS server or HTTP server has enough space to support this backup, okay? It will be zipped up in the end, right? So it will be compressed, but still might require a significant amount of space and a significant amount of time as we're doing this. When we do the restore, okay, it's also done in a two-step process from the Appliance GUI installer. So I'll select the restore button. A new appliance will be deployed onto an ESXi host. Then it'll prompt you for the backup file where that backup will be imported, and you'll have your entire inventory and all of the rest of the configuration of vCenter, along with stats, logs, and so on if you chose that. You can not only hit that backup now button, but if you select the configure button, it'll allow you to create a backup schedule where you can choose how often and when to backup, to create that backup. Hit the create button. You can also say how many copies of the backup will be retained and for how long. So it gives you a lot of different options. It's a relatively complete, at the very least, file-based backup process. You can view that backup schedule, you can edit it, disable it, delete the backup schedule, and so on. So through that VAMI interface, you have complete control of the file-based backup for vCenter server. Okay, so in the next segment, we're going to show you an example of a file-based backup and restore of a brand new vCenter server. Okay, this is taken from my home lab with no inventory, and you can see how long it'll take and how large the backup will be and so on a brand new greenfield, no configuration vCenter. Now, based on the amount of information that you have in your vCenter, you can determine, what the best strategy is around this as well. So enjoy that demonstration, and we'll come back to finish off this part of the lecture. Thanks. Welcome. My name is Joe Cooper with VMware Education. As vCenter Server becomes a more and more important component in our software-defined data center, it's ever more important that we're able to take proactive steps to protect it. Now, there's a number of ways to do this, of course. Simply using vSphere High Availability does a great job of protecting vCenter against hardware failures. You can also use the new vCenter High Availability feature to create replica vCenter servers that can take over from a failed vCenter system in even less time than it takes vSphere HA to kick in and completely restart the system. Now, when patching or performing maintenance on vCenter, you can always take a snapshot of your vCenter appliance VM to be sure that you have a rollback plan should something go wrong with your change. You can even rely on your backup team to ensure that the vCenter Appliance VM is backed up along with all of the other virtual machines in the environment. See, there's lots of ways to do this. But sometimes, as a vSphere administrator, we'd like to take that job into our own hands and be sure that we have the ability to take a backup on the spot or even create a regularly scheduled backup so that we have instant access to complete a restore operation more quickly and without relying on other complicated backup systems. So with the release of vSphere 6.5 and improved with every subsequent release of the vCenter appliance, VMware has introduced a file-based backup system and restore mechanism. And in this video, we're going to show you how this works. So what I've got here is a vSphere environment managed by a vCenter server. And I have built on top of that another vCenter virtual machine to act as a demonstration. If I open a web console to this, we can see our vCenter appliance here. And we can see its IP address 192.168.1.80. We can see its fully qualified domain name at vcenter01.thecoopers.lan. That's my home lab. Okay. And that if we visit the appliance at vcenter01.thecoopers.lan on port 5480, what we have is the vSphere Appliance Management Interface, or VAMI. Let's actually have a look at what this looks like. When we first bring this up, it'll prompt us to log in. We are here managing the appliance itself. So we're going to need to use an appliance username like root. Okay. As we log in as root, you'll see all kinds of really great information that you can do with this. But one thing that we're concerned about here with is backup. So if we go to this backup tab, you can see that I've done a couple of them already. Okay. Now, with the initial release of this, we supported FTP and HTTP. But as we have improved this, we now add NFS and CIFS or Samba shares to this feature. So all we have to do is configure this to push a vCenter backup. This is actually a file-based backup, right? A vCenter backup to a remote server. We can then use that remote server and the backup that it has to complete a restore operation should we lose vCenter. So let's see how this works. What I'm going to do is either configure a backup schedule where I'll push the location of the backup. Now the help info button here gives us really good information about the format that this should be in. Okay, we'll show the protocol and then the path. In my case, I actually built a little NFS server on a Synology device that I have in my home lab. So you can simply point to that. If you need credentials to access this, whether it's NFS 4.1 or if it's FTP or a CIFS or Samba share, add those credentials here and then schedule the backup. Okay, you can retain a certain number of backups or all of them and so on, right? The system will calculate for you the size of the backup itself. Now, in my case, you can see my vCenter server. So I've headed over to vcenter01.thecoopers.lan. It's empty. There's nothing here. There's no VMs, there's no hosts. I just built it for this demo. I created a cluster, right? And a data center. So it's called demo data center and demo cluster. Now, if for some reason this vCenter should go away, it blows up, okay? In this demo, I'll simply power it off once the backup is created, okay? Then we'll be able to create a new vCenter and import the data we had just backed up. So let's head back over here to the appliance. And rather than creating a schedule here, we'll hit the Backup Now button, okay? And the Backup Now says, point it to, choose the protocol first of all. I'll use NFS. Point it to your NFS server. My Synology is at 192.168.1.22. And point it to the path of the NFS export. In my case, it's on volume 2/NFS_vSphere, like so. Now, I'm using NFS version 3 with auth_sys authentication, so I don't need any credentials here. I'm not going to encrypt the backup if I don't want to, and so on. Okay, but here we've got the ability to do that. I can perform a database health check before the backup occurs, and I can choose what data I want to back up. Now, I've got to back up the inventory and configuration of vCenter. That's the big deal, right? But you can choose whether or not you additionally want to add statistics, events, and tasks. Now, in your case, this is going to be far larger than 286 megabytes because I'm going to assume that you've got stuff that you are managing in your vCenter, maybe hundreds or even thousands of hosts and virtual machines. I hate it when it says optional under description because you should always give it a description so that you know, for example, if I'm doing a manual backup, why I might be doing a manual backup. Let's call this a backup for demo purposes. And I'm going to hit the start button. Okay. So it's starting a backup. Now you're going to see that there's a couple of errors and I have a completed one just so you are aware I canceled these tests just in prep for this little demo here. Now in my experience, this is going to sit for a while, and what's going on here is it's actually creating the backup itself. Okay. This took probably 4.5 minutes out of the 5 minutes of the last backup. So it's exporting all of the logs, it's exporting all of the data that's there. So this piece will take some time. Then all of a sudden you'll see it jump and you'll see that it's transferring the data to in my case, my NFS share. Let's actually head over to that NFS share so that we can see what this looks like. I'll log into my little Synology device here. I'll open a file explorer and you'll see that NFS vSphere export along with all my other fun stuff. And you can see that here is the export and here's the vCenter. It's backing up and there's a folder path, and in that folder path there are a whole bunch of compressed gzip files. And you can kind of see by having a look at what the file names are exactly what vCenter components are backed up, are stored in these. Okay, so that's my backup. Let's go from there and we'll check back and see how our backup is actually proceeding. Okay, doing fine. Now at this point, we're going to speed up the video until it finishes. So you can see it's finally transferring. And now that it's transferring, it's actually moving pretty quickly. And 5 minutes later, the job is done. You can head back over to your NFS export here, do a little refresh. You can see that you've got a folder for your vCenter backups, and now we've got multiple vCenter backups here. Okay, so there's the new one. And it's listed, and you can see the times kind of match up very nicely right there. Okay, so that's the nice and easy backup process. In a second, we'll have a look at the restore process. Well, welcome back. So we're about ready to do now a restore of the backup that we had just placed on our Synology NFS share. So let's see how this works. This is what we're going to do. First of all, the idea here is that we've had some sort of catastrophic failure. So our existing vCenter, which can be accessed through its DCUI or through the vSphere client right here, has gone kablooey. So let's kablooey it. In fact, let's not shut it down gracefully. Let's just power the thing off. Okay. And gone. And gone. And yeah, that ain't coming. Whoops, not that one, but that's not coming back. None of these are coming back. Even the VAMIs, that's not coming back. None of that stuff is going to work right at this point because we have now lost our vCenter. Okay. I could even be kind of rude and delete that virtual machine if I wanted to. In fact, why don't I? Now we remember its DNS name was vCenter01.thecoopers.lan. And if you'll remember, it was running on 192.168.1.80. Okay. So at the very, you know what? At the very least, I'm going to remove it from inventory. Right now it's really, really gone. So how do we restore the thing? Well, the first thing that we need to do is come back to our vCenter installer that we had downloaded from VMware. And we know that this is an ISO image that we downloaded from VMware. And now I'm running this on Windows, but you can actually do this from a Mac and you can do this from a Linux machine. But I want to mount this ISO image. The way that I do it on Windows is I say open with Windows Explorer. Voila, there's the ISO image, and you're going to see the CLI installer within this ISO image. So let's go ahead and launch the CLI installer. There are a bunch of different versions, not the CLI installer, silly me, the UI installer. Here is the Win32 version of it, and you're going to see installer.exe right here, and we're going to launch the installer itself. Excellent. Okay, so we've got this installer launched. This is the exact same installer that I used to install vCenter or upgrade from 6.7 on the appliance or migrate from the Windows version of vCenter. Now I can actually do a restore. And the process is very similar. Let's go ahead and do this restore. It's going to do this just like the install did in 2 stages. The first thing it's going to do is deploy a brand new vCenter server. And then it's going to restore the settings from your old vCenter. So let's walk through the wizard here. Okay, so here's the introduction. We'll hit next. We'll accept the end user license agreement. And now we've got to find the backup. Okay, now if you will remember, one of the brand new features in vCenter 7 that we mentioned in the appliance was to do a backup to an NFS export or Samba export, or SMB CIFS. The restore doesn't work from those, unfortunately. We can use HTTP or FTP and the secure equivalents of those. So I've copied the URL. I set up FTP on my Synology, because why not? And I am going to point it to the folder where the backup JSON file lived. We're going to actually see that over here. So let's open up File Explorer. You'll see this backup metadata JSON file. Okay, this is the folder that we want to point it to. So back here in this UI installer, right, I've copied and pasted FTP://. Let's go ahead and add, of course, the IP address of the FTP server, and then the folder NFS vSphere, vCenter, and then, right, that's the full folder, and then there's the backup itself. In this case, we're going to give it a username and password that's acceptable to the FTP server. Very nice. Okay, it's going to establish a connection, and then it's going to read the metadata out of the backup. Right, there's the location of it. This is when the backup was. I didn't add a description in that first one. That's all right. There's the host name. It's a vCenter. It's got 2 vCPU and 12 gigs of RAM, and there's the backup version, and there's the version of vCenter. Excellent. 359 gigs of disk space. That's the configuration with that vCenter. Okay, now where are we going to put it? Now in my case, I'm going to put it on an ESXi host. I could just as easily put this on the vCenter that's managing that host. Okay, and it's actually probably a better idea. But the reason I want to point this to vCenter02 is to remind you that if you are doing this directly to a host, if this host is a part of a DRS cluster, you're going to want to make sure that you disable that you disable fully automated mode in DRS, so that as soon as this thing gets built and powered on, it doesn't actually start vMotioning all over the place, and now all of a sudden it's not located on vCenter02. Okay, so DRS must be in manual mode or disabled on the cluster that the host lives in. All right, fine. I'll type in the password for the root user on the host. It's going to configure, it's going to verify the thumbprint, give me a certificate warning saying it doesn't like that. And now it's going to ask me for a new name for the new virtual machine it's about to deploy. I'll call it vCenter 01 restored. Just because I can't call it vCenter 01, well, I actually could have. We'll call it vCenter 01. Why not? Because I had already removed that VM from the inventory. So there's at least not a duplicate VM. Okay. You have a root password. And hit next. Set the deployment size is coming next. I'll leave it just like it was. Select the data store. I'm going to put it on my vSAN array. Configure the network settings. It's going to grab the network settings from the backup. There's the fully qualified domain name. There's its IP address. We've got its subnet mask, prefix length, right? And its default gateway and the DNS servers. Wonderful. And now I am ready to deploy. But you know what? I'm actually going to go back and select thin on the data store. I should be able to do that. I missed it. There's thin disk mode. Very nice. And we'll run through. Okay. It is always a good idea to review this. After all, I actually just caught that. I didn't want to consume all that vast amount of disk space in my 300 and something gigs on my little vSAN data store in my case. Okay. So make sure you review that. Now you're going to hit the finish button. Now we're doing 2 stages, right? We're going to deploy the vCenter server, and then we're going to restore the settings. Okay, so we are now ready to continue on to stage 2. But let's have a look at actually what's happened in the environment here. So the restore that we did actually showed or brought in the old VM because we had deleted it after we did the backup. So we can remove that from inventory again, and we see this brand new vCenter 01 VM that has been built and powered on. Now at this point, it isn't configured. We haven't imported any data whatsoever, but we'll notice that we've got the fully qualified domain name, vcenter01.thecoopers.lan. We have its IP address, 192.168.1.80, and any systems that at one point relied on this can continue to rely on it. So let's go ahead and continue to load stage 2, where actually the backup now will be imported into the environment. This is a very simple process at this point. We're just reviewing the backup details, okay? It points us to the backup. It's got the username and it's got the password. And it notices, hey, you're running FTP, not FTPS. It's not encrypted. Fine. We'll hit next and it'll validate itself. Now, we'll add the single sign-on username and password here, right? This proves that we actually have rights to this environment. Okay, so I set up administrator at lab.lan as opposed to not lan.local, but it was lab.lan or lab.local rather. We'll see actually what that looks like. It's going to validate this. Okay. It's giving us a couple of warnings here, and it's saying, hey, I typed in the password wrong. Okay, we can ignore that actually and go ahead and restore. Okay, it also lets us know that at one point this thing was in linked mode with another VM. I had actually done a converge, so we'll go ahead and ignore those errors and proceed. It's also noticing that says, hey, make sure that you shut down the old vCenter first. Okay, otherwise we're going to have an IP address conflict. We had already done that, right? So let's hit the finish button, click OK, and it's going to continue the restore. Okay, this is really great. The job finished successfully. The services have started, and we've restored the vCenter. We'll come over here and do it. Let's first of all check on our vCenter server itself. You can launch a web console. It's hanging in there. All right, that all looks good. We'll head over to the VAMI interface, see how this is doing. Prompts us for a login. We'll head over to vCenter, and vCenter itself through the vSphere client is loading. And would you look at that? Our data center is there, our cluster is there, and our virtual machine is back. All right, including the expiring licenses. Well, that's great, everybody. So that shows us how to do a backup and a file-based restore, file-based backup and file-based restore of our vCenter appliance. That does it for me. Have a nice evening, good day, good morning. Take it easy. We'll see you next time. All right, I hope that demonstration was useful to you. Okay, we've created an appliance backup schedule and done a restore of that appliance as well. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you soon for the next lesson, monitoring the vCenter appliance.